The drawing-room fell silent as Daphne Ashford's sleeve slipped, revealing dark purple marks encircling her delicate wrist. Duke Benedict Harrington's teacup froze midway to his lips, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the evidence of brutality marring his ward's porcelain skin. She hastily tugged the fabric down, but it was too late. The Duke had seen everything. That evening, as fog rolled through the streets of London, Lord Percival Blackwood, Daphne's fiancé and heir to one of England's most powerful families, left his club on St. James's Street. He never arrived home. By morning, whispers spread through Mayfair like wildfire. The cruel lord had vanished without a trace, and the Duke's ward was suddenly inexplicably free. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The year was 1887, and London's elite moved through their gilded existence with the precision of clockwork. Among them, Miss Daphne Ashford occupied a peculiar position, neither quite family nor servant, but the orphaned ward of the formidable Duke of Harrington, a man whose influence stretched from Parliament to the Queen's own court. Daphne had been raised within the marble halls of Harrington House since the age of 7, when her father, the Duke's closest friend and military companion, had perished in a colonial skirmish. The Duke, honouring a deathbed promise, had taken the golden-haired child into his household, ensuring she received every advantage befitting a gentleman's daughter. She was educated by the finest governesses presented at court and groomed for a destiny that had been decided long before she understood its implications. At 22, Daphne possessed the kind of beauty that painters immortalized: pale skin like fresh cream, eyes the color of spring violets, and hair that cascaded in honey-colored waves. Yet there was something in her gaze, a quiet intelligence that made her different from the simpering debutantes who populated London's ballrooms. She read voraciously, spoke 3 languages, and harbored secret dreams of traveling beyond England's shores, of seeing the world her father had described in his letters. But such dreams were foolish indulgences. Her path had been determined years ago, sealed by an agreement between the Duke and his long-time political ally, the Earl of Blackwood. Daphne would marry the Earl's son, Lord Percival Blackwood, uniting 2 of England's most powerful families in a alliance that would benefit both houses for generations. Lord Percival was everything society deemed desirable: tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, and heir to a fortune that rivaled the Queen's own. He moved through society with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, his sharp features and calculating eyes marking him as a force to be reckoned with in both business and politics. Their engagement had been announced 6 months prior, at a glittering ball that had been the talk of the season. Daphne had smiled and accepted congratulations, playing her role with the grace expected of a duke's ward. But as the weeks passed and she spent more time in Percival's company, a cold dread had begun to settle in her chest. He was charming in public, attentive before witnesses, but in private moments, a carriage ride, a walk in the garden, a quiet corner at a dinner party, his mask slipped. His grip on her arm would tighten until it hurt. His compliments carried barbs that left her feeling small and foolish. He criticized her opinions, mocked her interests, and made it clear that once they were married, she would exist solely to enhance his position and produce his heirs. "You read too much," he had told her just last week, plucking a volume of poetry from her hands. "It gives women ideas above their station. Once we're married, I'll expect you to focus on proper wifely duties, managing the household, entertaining my associates, and looking decorative. Your guardian has been far too indulgent with you." Daphne had learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to nod and smile, to avoid the situations that triggered his displeasure. But it was never enough. His need to control, to dominate, seemed to grow with each passing week. The wedding was set for 3 months hence, and with each day that brought it closer, Daphne felt the walls of her golden cage closing in. The Duke, for all his power and intelligence, seemed blind to Percival's true nature. He saw only the accomplished young lord, the brilliant political mind, the worthy successor to the Blackwood legacy. When Daphne had attempted once to express her reservations, the Duke had patted her hand kindly and assured her that pre-wedding nerves were perfectly natural. "Percival is a good match, my dear," he had said, his weathered face kind but firm. "He will provide for you, protect you, give you a position in society that your dear father would have wanted for you. This union secures your future." So Daphne had retreated into silence, playing her role with increasing desperation. She attended fittings for her wedding gown, approved menus for the reception, and smiled through endless social engagements where she and Percival were displayed as the perfect couple. Only her lady's maid, Sarah, saw the bruises that appeared with increasing frequency, finger marks on her arms, a darkening on her shoulder where Percival had shoved her against a wall during an argument about her impertinent tone. Daphne concealed them carefully, wearing long sleeves even in warm weather, choosing high-necked gowns, and avoiding situations where she might need to undress before others. The morning of the fateful tea had begun like any other. Daphne had dressed carefully in a lavender day dress with long sleeves, pinned her hair in an elegant chignon, and descended to the drawing room where the Duke took his afternoon tea. It was their ritual, one of the few times she could simply be herself, discussing books and current events with the man who had been more father to her than guardian. The Duke was reading the Times when she entered, his distinguished features relaxed in the comfort of his own home. At 63, Benedict Harrington remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and those penetrating grey eyes that had intimidated opponents in Parliament for decades. But with Daphne, he had always been gentle, encouraging her curiosity and intelligence in ways that Percival found threatening. They had been discussing a recent archaeological discovery in Egypt when Daphne reached for the sugar bowl. The movement pulled her sleeve up just enough, revealing the dark purple bruises that encircled her wrist like a grotesque bracelet, the result of Percival's fury 2 days prior when she had dared to disagree with him about a political matter at a dinner party. The Duke's reaction was instantaneous. His teacup halted mid-air, his entire body going rigid. Those grey eyes, usually so warm when they looked at her, turned to ice as they fixed on her exposed wrist. "Daphne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What is that?" She jerked her sleeve down, her heart hammering. "Nothing, Your Grace. I merely bumped into a door." "Show me your arm." It was not a request. The Duke set down his cup with deliberate care, and Daphne knew that tone. She had heard him use it in Parliament, had seen grown men quail before it. Slowly, her hands trembling, she pushed back her sleeve. The bruises were worse in full light, deep purple and yellow, the clear imprint of fingers that had gripped with vicious intent. The Duke's face transformed into something she had never seen before, a cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "Who did this to you?" Though he surely knew. "Tell me the truth." Daphne's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the words she had held back for months came pouring out. Percival's cruelty, his controlling nature, his escalating violence. The Duke listened in terrible silence, his hands clenched into fists, a muscle working in his jaw. When she finished, he stood, his full height suddenly intimidating even to her. "You will not marry that man," he said, his voice like iron. "I will handle this matter." "You have my word, Daphne. Lord Percival Blackwood will never lay hands on you again." That night, as fog rolled through London streets, Lord Percival Blackwood vanished, and Daphne's life would never be the same. The morning after Percival's disappearance, London awoke to scandal. Servants whispered in kitchens, society matrons clutched their pearls over breakfast, and newsboys shouted headlines that sent shockwaves through Mayfair. Lord Percival Blackwood, heir to one of England's most distinguished families, had vanished without a trace after leaving his gentleman's club on St. James's Street. The Earl of Blackwood arrived at Harrington House before noon, his face mottled with rage and barely concealed panic. Daphne watched from the top of the stairs as the Duke received him in the study, their raised voices carrying through the heavy oak door. She caught fragments. "Your ward, my son, consequences," before the Duke's voice cut through like a blade, cold and final. Whatever was said in that room, the Earl emerged 20 minutes later looking 10 years older, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Within hours, a messenger delivered a formal letter to Harrington House. Daphne's hands shook as she broke the seal, recognizing the Blackwood crest. The words were brief and devastating. Given the recent unfortunate circumstances and the unsuitability of the match, the Blackwood family hereby releases Miss Daphne Ashford from all obligations regarding her engagement to Lord Percival Blackwood. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. In Victorian society, a broken engagement was a catastrophe, but a broken engagement under mysterious circumstances was social suicide. By that evening, the rumors had already begun. Whispers that she had driven Percival away with her unnatural intelligence, her unwomanly opinions, her difficult nature. The Duke, sensing the gathering storm, made a decision. "You will attend Lady Pemberton's ball tomorrow evening," he announced over dinner. "We will face this directly, with dignity." Running would only confirm their worst suspicions. Daphne's stomach twisted with dread, but she nodded. She had been raised to face consequences with grace, even when those consequences were monumentally unfair. Lady Pemberton's annual ball was one of the season's most prestigious events, held in a Belgravia mansion that glittered like a jewel box. As Daphne ascended the marble staircase on the Duke's arm, wearing a gown of ice-blue silk that made her look ethereal and untouchable, she felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her. The whispers started immediately, a rustling susurrus that followed her like a shadow. The Duke's presence provided some protection. No one would dare cut her directly while she was under his escort. But the damage was evident in every averted gaze, every conversation that stopped abruptly as she passed, every former friend who suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Then she saw them. Percival's sister, Lady Charlotte Blackwood, held court near the refreshment table, surrounded by a cluster of society's most vicious gossips. Charlotte was everything Daphne was not, bold, ambitious, and utterly ruthless in her social maneuvering. She had always resented Daphne's engagement to her brother, viewing it as a waste of Percival's potential on an orphan with no family connections of her own. Charlotte's voice carried across the ballroom with calculated precision. "Of course, one must wonder what really happened. My poor brother vanished without a trace, and his fiancée shows not a tear. Some women, I'm told, have such cold natures that they drive men to desperate acts." The words landed like physical blows. Daphne felt the Duke stiffen beside her, but before he could respond, Charlotte continued, her eyes glittering with malice. "I've heard she was always peculiar, reading philosophy, expressing opinions on politics, behaving as though she were a man's intellectual equal. Is it any wonder my brother might have had second thoughts? Perhaps he simply couldn't bear the prospect of a lifetime with such an unnatural creature." The crowd around Charlotte tittered nervously. Daphne stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation. This was worse than she had imagined. Not just social censure, but active character assassination. Charlotte was painting her as a monster, a woman so fundamentally flawed that she had driven her fiancé to disappear rather than marry her. "And now," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "she parades herself here as though nothing has happened, as though she hasn't destroyed my family's peace and my brother's future. One would think she might have the decency to withdraw from society until this matter is resolved." The Duke's hand tightened on Daphne's arm, not in anger at her, but in restraint of his own fury. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "How curious, Lady Charlotte, that you speak of decency while engaging in public character assassination." The crowd parted, and Daphne found herself looking at a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, with dark auburn hair and striking green eyes that held both intelligence and something harder. A man who had seen the world's ugliness and survived it. His evening clothes were impeccably tailored, but somehow different from the other men's, less ornate, more practical, marking him as someone who existed slightly outside society's rigid conventions. Charlotte's face flushed with anger. "And who, sir, are you to interrupt a private conversation?" "Dr. Benjamin Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of education overlaid with something else, time spent abroad, perhaps. "Recently returned from India, where I served as a military surgeon, and I find it fascinating that you condemn Miss Ashford for qualities that would be praised in any man: intelligence, education, independent thought. Tell me, is it only men who are permitted to have minds?" A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to Lady Charlotte Blackwood this way, especially not a relative unknown, but Dr. Thorne seemed utterly unconcerned with social niceties. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "My brother's disappearance is a family tragedy, Dr. Thorne. You know nothing of the circumstances. I know that blaming a woman for a man's actions is a coward's game," he replied coolly, "and I know that true nobility lies in character, not title. From where I stand, Miss Ashford has shown remarkable grace under circumstances that would break lesser individuals." He turned to Daphne then, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes, recognition, as though he understood exactly what she had endured. "Miss Ashford, I wonder if you might honor me with this dance, unless, of course, these good people believe that a broken engagement should condemn you to a lifetime of isolation." It was a challenge, thrown directly at the assembled crowd. Daphne felt the Duke's subtle nod of approval. With trembling legs but lifted chin, she placed her hand in Dr. Thorne's and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved through the waltz, he spoke quietly. "I apologize for the presumption, but you looked as though you could use an ally. The Duke is a friend of my late father's. He mentioned your situation when I called on him yesterday." "You did this deliberately," Daphne said, understanding dawning. "You came here knowing what would happen." "I came here because injustice offends me," he corrected, "and because I've seen enough of the world to recognize courage when I see it. Whatever happened with Lord Blackwood, I suspect you're better off without him." Daphne's eyes stung with unexpected tears. It was the first kindness anyone outside the Duke's household had shown her in days. "You don't know what you've done," she whispered. "Charlotte Blackwood is vindictive. She'll make you pay for this." Dr. Thorne smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Miss Ashford, I've survived cholera outbreaks, battlefield surgery, and a tiger attack in Bengal. I think I can handle one spiteful aristocrat." Despite everything, Daphne found herself smiling back. As the waltz ended and Dr. Thorne escorted her back to the Duke, she felt something shift inside her, a tiny spark of hope that perhaps her life wasn't over after all. But Charlotte Blackwood watched from across the ballroom, her face twisted with fury. This wasn't over, not by a long measure, and Daphne would soon learn that some enemies never forgave, and some battles were only beginning. The scandal intensified over the following weeks. Charlotte Blackwood proved as vindictive as Dr. Thorne had predicted, using her considerable social influence to ensure that Daphne was systematically excluded from every respectable drawing room in London. Invitations that had once arrived daily ceased entirely. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Even the tradespeople began treating her with barely concealed disdain, as though her disgrace might somehow contaminate their establishments. The Duke watched his ward withdraw into herself, spending hours in the library, barely eating, her violet eyes losing their spark. Finally, one morning at breakfast, he made an announcement that would change everything. "I've written to my sister," he said, setting down his newspaper with deliberate care. "Lady Agatha has agreed to receive you in Bath for the season. A change of scenery will do you good, and Agatha has never cared a fig for London society's opinions." Daphne looked up, startled. She had met the Duke's sister only twice, a formidable woman in her late 50s who had scandalized society by refusing to remarry after her husband's death, instead dedicating herself to charitable work and intellectual pursuits. Lady Agatha Harrington lived in an elegant townhouse in Bath's Royal Crescent, surrounded by books, artists and reformers rather than the usual society crowd. "She wants me?" Daphne asked, her voice small. "She insists upon it," the Duke replied, and there was warmth in his steel-grey eyes. "Agatha says London has become insufferably dull, and she requires intelligent company. She's also mentioned something about introducing you to her literary circle. Apparently they're always seeking new perspectives." 3 days later, Daphne found herself on a train to Bath, watching London's smoke-stained buildings give way to rolling countryside. Sarah, her loyal maid, sat beside her, chattering excitedly about the change, but Daphne felt only numbness, as though she were watching her own life from a great distance. Lady Agatha met them at Bath Spa station herself, driving her own carriage, another scandalous habit that made Daphne's lips twitch with the first hint of amusement she'd felt in weeks. The older woman was striking rather than beautiful, with iron-grey hair, sharp hazel eyes, and the Duke's same commanding presence, softened by genuine warmth. "So you're the girl who set London on its ear," Agatha said, looking Daphne up and down with frank assessment. "Good. That cesspool needed stirring. Now let's get you home and fed properly. You look like a strong wind could blow you away." Lady Agatha's townhouse was a revelation. Unlike the formal grandeur of Harrington House, this was a home designed for living and thinking. Books overflowed from shelves onto tables and chairs. Paintings by unknown artists covered the walls. The drawing room hosted a pianoforte, a globe, and what appeared to be scientific equipment, alongside the usual furniture. "I host a salon every Thursday evening," Agatha explained over tea that first afternoon. "Writers, artists, physicians, reformers, anyone with an interesting mind and something worthwhile to say. No titles required, no social credentials necessary, just intelligence and curiosity. I think you'll find it refreshing after London's vapid ballrooms." Daphne felt something unfurl in her chest, a cautious hope. "Your brother mentioned you have a literary circle." "Indeed. We're currently reading and discussing the works of George Eliot, a woman who had to use a man's name to be taken seriously, which tells you everything about society's idiocy. We meet Tuesday afternoons. You're welcome to join us, though I warn you, we don't simply nod and agree. We debate, we argue, we challenge each other's interpretations. Can you handle that?" For the first time in months, Daphne smiled genuinely. "I think I'd like to try." The first Thursday salon was both terrifying and exhilarating. Daphne entered the drawing room to find it filled with perhaps 20 people, men and women, young and old, dressed in everything from evening clothes to bohemian artistic garb. Lady Agatha introduced her simply as "my niece, Miss Ashford, recently escaped from London's suffocating conformity." There was laughter, welcoming nods, and then the conversation resumed as though she'd always been there. They discussed everything: the Irish question, women's education, Darwin's theories, the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt. Daphne found herself drawn into a debate about social reform with a passionate young woman named Eleanor, who worked at a settlement house for the poor. "The problem isn't charity," Eleanor argued, her dark eyes flashing. "It's systemic inequality. We need education, fair wages, political representation, not just wealthy ladies distributing baskets." "Oh, but surely immediate relief matters while we work toward larger change," Daphne countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "People are starving now. We can't tell them to wait for political reform." "Both are necessary," a male voice interjected. Daphne turned to find Dr. Benjamin Thorne standing behind her, holding a glass of wine and looking amused. "Miss Ashford, what an unexpected pleasure." Daphne's heart skipped. She hadn't seen him since Lady Pemberton's ball, though she'd thought of him often, his kindness, his courage in defending her. "Dr. Thorne, I didn't know you were acquainted with Lady Agatha." "I've been attending her salons since returning from India," he explained. "Your aunt is one of the few people in England who values experience over pedigree. She's been kind enough to let me present some of my research on tropical diseases." "Benjamin is being modest," Agatha said, appearing at Daphne's elbow. "His work on cholera prevention has saved countless lives. He's also been instrumental in establishing a free clinic for Bath's poor, something the city's more respectable physicians consider beneath them." As the evening progressed, Daphne found herself in conversation after conversation that challenged and stimulated her mind in ways she'd never experienced. No one asked about her broken engagement or Percival's disappearance. No one treated her as damaged goods or a social pariah. Here, she was simply Daphne, a young woman with thoughts and opinions that mattered. Dr. Thorne seemed to appear at her side repeatedly throughout the evening, their conversations ranging from literature to medicine to his experiences in India. He spoke of the poverty he'd witnessed, the diseases he'd fought, the beauty and complexity of a culture so different from England's rigid society. "You speak of India with such passion," Daphne observed. "Do you miss it?" "Parts of it," he admitted. "The sense of purpose, mostly. In the military hospitals, your value was determined by your skill and dedication, not your family name or social connections. It was liberating." "I think I understand that feeling," Daphne said softly. "Or at least I'm beginning to." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition, understanding, the beginning of connection. But before either could speak further, Agatha called for attention, announcing that a local poet would read from his latest work. The Tuesday Literary Circle proved equally transformative. 6 women gathered in Agatha's morning room, ranging from a widow in her 70s to a young governess barely older than Daphne. They dissected Middlemarch with fierce intelligence, debating Dorothea's choices, Lydgate's failures, and Eliot's commentary on society's constraints. "Dorothea's tragedy is that she has the soul of a reformer, but no outlet for her passion," said Mrs. Fletcher, the elderly widow. "Society offers her only marriage and charity work, both ultimately limiting. But she chooses poorly," the governess Miss Peters argued. "She romanticizes Casaubon, seeing what she wants rather than what he is." "It's a warning about the dangers of idealism, or a commentary on how little choice women actually have," Daphne heard herself say. She's 20, sheltered, told that marriage is her only path to meaningful life. How can she choose wisely when she's been given no tools for judgment, no experience of the world? The room fell silent, and Daphne feared she'd overstepped. Then Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "Precisely. And that, my dears, is why education for women matters so desperately. We cannot make good choices without knowledge and experience." As weeks passed, Daphne felt herself transforming. The constant fear that had characterized her final months with Percival began to fade. Her appetite returned. She laughed again. She discovered that she had opinions on everything from architecture to zoology, and that people actually wanted to hear them. Dr. Thorne became a regular presence in her life. He attended every salon, often arriving early or staying late, finding reasons to speak with her. He brought her books from his own collection, invited her to tour his clinic, and listened to her thoughts with genuine interest, rather than Percival's patronizing tolerance. One afternoon, as they walked through Bath's Royal Victoria Park, he spoke of his future plans. "I'm considering establishing a teaching hospital," he said. "Somewhere that trains physicians in modern techniques while providing care to those who can't afford private doctors. Your aunt has offered to help with funding and connections." "It sounds wonderful," Daphne said, meaning it. "You could change so many lives." "I hope so." He paused, then added quietly, "I've seen too much suffering that could be prevented with proper knowledge and care. In India, I watched children die of diseases we know how to treat simply because their families couldn't pay. It's unconscionable." Daphne looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just kindness but purpose, integrity, a man who measured his worth by his contributions rather than his title. He was everything Percival had pretended to be, but never was. "You're staring," he said, a smile playing at his lips. She blushed, but didn't look away. "I was thinking that you're rather remarkable, Dr. Thorne. Benjamin," he corrected gently. "And I think you're rather remarkable yourself, Miss Ashford. You've survived something that would have broken most people, and you're not just surviving, you're flourishing. That takes extraordinary strength." As they walked back toward Royal Crescent, Daphne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine happiness, and the thrilling possibility that her life might hold more than she'd ever imagined. 3 months in Bath had transformed Daphne in ways she could never have anticipated. The pale, frightened girl who had arrived at Lady Agatha's doorstep had blossomed into a confident young woman with purpose and direction. She had begun volunteering at Benjamin's clinic twice weekly, assisting with patient records and discovering an unexpected aptitude for medical organization. The work was meaningful, challenging, and utterly fulfilling in ways that planning tea parties and embroidering pillowcases had never been. Her relationship with Benjamin had deepened into something neither of them had explicitly named, but both clearly felt. They spent hours in conversation, their minds meeting with an ease that felt both natural and extraordinary. He valued her intelligence, sought her opinions, and treated her as an equal partner in discussions ranging from medical ethics to social reform. When he looked at her, she saw respect, admiration, and something warmer that made her heart race. Lady Agatha watched their growing attachment with satisfaction. "That boy has been alone too long," she told Daphne one morning. "He needs someone who can match his mind and share his purpose. And you, my dear, need someone who sees your strength rather than fearing it." Then came the letter from the Duke. London's Royal Society of Medicine was hosting its annual gala, a prestigious event combining scientific presentation with social celebration. Benjamin had been invited to present his research on cholera prevention, and the Duke suggested that Daphne accompany Lady Agatha to support him. "It's time," the Duke wrote, "for London to see what you've become. Let them witness your transformation, and let them choke on their previous judgments." Daphne's first instinct was refusal. The thought of facing London society again made her stomach clench with remembered humiliation. But Benjamin, when she confessed her fears, took her hands in his. "You don't have to go," he said gently, "but I want you to know that you have nothing to be ashamed of. You survived something terrible, and you've built a new life with courage and grace. If you choose to attend, I would be honored to have you there, but the choice is entirely yours." It was the respect in his voice, the absolute lack of pressure, that decided her. Percival had demanded and controlled. Benjamin offered choice and support. She would go to London, not to prove anything to society, but to prove something to herself, that she was no longer the frightened girl who had let others define her worth. The gala was held at the Royal Society's Grand Hall, a magnificent space of marble columns and glittering chandeliers. Daphne arrived with Lady Agatha and the Duke, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the violet in her eyes. Her hair was dressed in an elegant style that was fashionable but not ostentatious, and she wore her grandmother's pearls, the only jewelry her father had left her. As they entered, heads turned. Whispers started immediately, but Daphne held her head high, her hand steady on the Duke's arm. She was no longer the broken girl they had gossiped about. She was a woman with purpose, intelligence, and the support of people who valued her for herself. Benjamin's presentation was scheduled for early in the evening. Daphne found a seat near the front, watching as he took the stage with quiet confidence. He spoke of his research with passion and clarity, explaining complex medical concepts in ways that even non-physicians could understand. He described the devastating cholera outbreaks he'd witnessed in India, the patterns he'd observed, and the preventive measures that could save thousands of lives. The audience was rapt. Even the most distinguished physicians in the room leaned forward, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. When Benjamin finished, the applause was thunderous. Daphne felt pride swell in her chest. Not the possessive pride of ownership, but the joy of witnessing someone she cared for being recognized for their genuine merit. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening shifted to social mingling, Daphne found herself surrounded by people curious about her connection to the brilliant Dr. Thorne. She answered questions with poise, describing his clinic in Bath, his dedication to serving the poor, his vision for medical education reform. Then she saw them. Charlotte Blackwood stood near the refreshment table, resplendent in ruby silk, holding court as always. But beside her stood someone Daphne hadn't expected, Percival himself. He looked different, thinner, with shadows under his eyes and a nervous energy that was new. When their eyes met across the room, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. He whispered something to Charlotte, who turned to stare at Daphne with undisguised venom. Benjamin appeared at Daphne's side, as though sensing her distress. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "He's here," she whispered. "Percival, he's alive." Benjamin's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Then let him see what he lost. Let him see the woman you've become without him." Charlotte was already moving toward them, Percival trailing reluctantly behind. The crowd parted, sensing drama, and suddenly Daphne found herself face to face with her former fiancé for the first time since his mysterious disappearance. "Miss Ashford," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how unexpected to see you here. I thought you'd retired permanently to Bath after your difficulties." "Lady Charlotte," Daphne replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Lord Blackwood, I'm pleased to see you well. Your disappearance caused quite a stir." Percival shifted uncomfortably. Up close, Daphne could see the changes in him more clearly, the haunted look in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. Whatever had happened during his absence, it had marked him. "Yes, well," he said, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "There were circumstances, family matters that required my immediate attention abroad." "How convenient," Benjamin said, his tone pleasant, but his eyes hard. "Family matters that coincidentally arose the very night you were meant to answer for your treatment of Miss Ashford." Charlotte's face flushed with anger. "How dare you imply—" "I imply nothing," Benjamin interrupted smoothly. "I merely observed that Lord Blackwood's sudden departure spared him a rather uncomfortable conversation with the Duke of Harrington. A conversation that, I understand, would have involved certain Bruises and their origins." The crowd around them had gone silent, straining to hear every word. Percival's face went white, then red. "You know nothing of the matter," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know that Miss Ashford has flourished in your absence," Benjamin replied. "She's become an invaluable asset to my clinic, demonstrating organizational skills and compassion that benefit dozens of patients weekly. She's a respected member of Lady Agatha's intellectual circle, contributing insights that challenge and enlighten some of Bath's finest minds. In short, she's become everything she was always capable of being, once freed from your diminishing influence." Daphne stared at Benjamin, her heart swelling. He wasn't defending her as though she were fragile or needed protection. He was simply stating facts, presenting her accomplishments as the evidence they were of her worth. Charlotte's eyes narrowed dangerously. How touching! The orphan ward has found herself a knight in surgeon's clothing. "Tell me, Dr. Thorne, does your noble defense stem from genuine admiration, or merely from the prospect of marrying into the Duke's fortune?" The insult hung in the air like poison, but before Benjamin could respond, Daphne stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Dr. Thorne's defense stems from his character, Lady Charlotte. Something you might not recognize, given your own deficiency in that area. He values people for their minds and hearts, not their bank accounts or titles. It's a revolutionary concept, I know, but some of us have evolved beyond viewing human beings as mere assets to be acquired." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to Charlotte Blackwood this way, but Daphne was no longer afraid. She had survived worse than social censure, and she had found her voice. Charlotte's face twisted with rage, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Miss Ashford speaks wisely as always." The Duke had appeared, his presence commanding immediate attention. "And I believe Dr. Thorne has something he wishes to say." Benjamin turned to Daphne, and in his eyes she saw everything: respect, admiration, and love. He took her hand, and the gesture was both intimate and public, a declaration before all of London society. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "these past months have been the most meaningful of my life, largely because of you. You've challenged my thinking, supported my work, and shown me what true partnership looks like. I know this is perhaps not the most conventional setting, but I've never been one for convention. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Daphne felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, not pain. She looked at Benjamin, this remarkable man who saw her, truly saw her, and valued everything she was. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Benjamin, I will." As he slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold with a small emerald, the crowd burst into applause. Not everyone was pleased, certainly. Charlotte looked apoplectic, and Percival seemed to shrink into himself. But many faces showed genuine happiness, and Daphne realized that London society was not monolithic. There were good people here too, people who valued love and merit over scandal and gossip. The Duke embraced her warmly. "Your father would be so proud," he whispered. "As am I." As the evening continued, Daphne and Benjamin were surrounded by well-wishers. The conversation had shifted entirely, no longer about her broken engagement or Percival's disappearance, but about their future, Benjamin's work, their plans. Percival and Charlotte left early, their defeat evident, and Daphne felt something release in her chest, the last remnant of fear, of shame, of believing she was somehow to blame for Percival's cruelty. She was free, truly free, and her future stretched before her bright with possibility. The announcement of Daphne's engagement to Dr. Benjamin Thorne sent ripples through London society that were markedly different from the scandal of her broken betrothal to Percival. This time the whispers carried notes of admiration rather than condemnation. The story had transformed in the public imagination, no longer the tale of a disgraced woman, but of a courageous young lady who had escaped a cruel fate and found true love with a heroic physician. The Times ran a feature on Benjamin's medical work, mentioning his forthcoming marriage to Miss Daphne Ashford, ward of the Duke of Harrington, a young woman known for her charitable work and intellectual pursuits. Other papers followed suit, and suddenly Daphne found herself reimagined as a romantic heroine rather than a social pariah. Invitations began arriving again at Harrington House, but Daphne viewed them with new eyes. She accepted some, those from people who had shown genuine kindness or whose company she actually enjoyed. The others she declined without guilt, having learned that social approval was far less important than personal integrity. The wedding was planned for 2 months hence, to be held in Bath rather than London, a deliberate choice that honoured the place where Daphne had rediscovered herself. Lady Agatha threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, though she respected Daphne's wish for a relatively intimate ceremony focused on meaning rather than spectacle. "I've attended enough ostentatious society weddings to last 3 lifetimes," Agatha declared. "Let's create something beautiful and genuine instead, a celebration of love and partnership, not a display of wealth and status." One afternoon, 3 weeks after the engagement, Daphne received an unexpected visitor at Harrington House. The butler announced Lord Percival Blackwood, and Daphne's first instinct was to refuse him. But curiosity, and perhaps a need for closure, made her agree to see him in the drawing room, with the door left properly open and a footman stationed nearby. Percival entered looking haggard, his former arrogance completely absent. He stood awkwardly near the door, as though afraid to come closer. "Miss Ashford, thank you for seeing me. I wasn't certain you would." I nearly didn't, Daphne said honestly, remaining seated. What do you want, Lord Blackwood? He flinched at her formal tone. I came to apologize. I know it's inadequate and far too late, but I needed to say it. What I did to you, how I treated you, was unconscionable. You deserved better, and I was a monster. Daphne studied him, seeing not the terrifying figure from her nightmares, but a broken man consumed by his own demons. What happened to you, Percival? Where did you go that night? He laughed bitterly. Your guardian happened to me. The Duke made it very clear that if I didn't disappear immediately, certain information about my proclivities would become public. He had evidence, Miss Ashford. Testimony from servants, medical documentation of your injuries, even witnesses to some of my more public displays of temper. He could have destroyed my family's reputation entirely. Instead, he gave me a choice. Vanish for a time, break the engagement, and never come near you again, or face complete social and legal ruin. So you chose exile, Daphne said quietly. I chose survival. I went to Scotland, then to the continent. I had time to think, to see myself clearly for perhaps the first time. My father's expectations, the pressure to be perfect, to dominate, to control, I let it twist me into something vile. But that's no excuse. I hurt you, terrified you, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. Daphne felt an unexpected wave of pity. Percival had been cruel, yes, but he had also been trapped in his own cage, one built by societal expectations and family pressure. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped her understand them. I appreciate your apology, she said finally. But I want you to know something, Percival. I don't forgive you for your sake. I forgive you for mine. I refuse to carry the weight of your cruelty any longer. I'm moving forward with my life, and that life has no room for bitterness or fear. He nodded, tears visible in his eyes. You've become remarkable, Miss Ashford. Dr. Thorne is a fortunate man. I hope you'll be very happy. I intend to be, Daphne said firmly. And Percival, I hope you find help. Whatever drove you to such cruelty, address it, become better. Not for me, but for yourself and anyone else who might cross your path. After he left, Daphne sat in the drawing room for a long time, processing the encounter. She felt lighter somehow, as though confronting her past had freed her from its lingering shadows. When Benjamin arrived that evening for dinner, she told him everything. How do you feel? He asked, taking her hand. Free, she said simply, truly free. He has no power over me anymore, not even the power to make me hate him. I'm just done with that chapter of my life. Benjamin raised her hand to his lips. Then let's focus on the next chapter, our chapter. The following weeks were filled with joyful preparation. Daphne worked with Lady Agatha to plan a ceremony that reflected their values, simple but elegant, focused on commitment rather than pageantry. They would marry in Bath Abbey, followed by a reception at Lady Agatha's home for close friends and family. Daphne's wedding gown was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Ivory silk with delicate lace, beautiful but not ostentatious. As she stood for fittings, she thought of the elaborate confection that had been prepared for her wedding to Percival, all white satin and excessive embellishment. This dress felt like her, refined, genuine, chosen rather than imposed. She also insisted on continuing her work at Benjamin's clinic right up until the wedding. Some society matrons clucked their tongues at such unconventional behavior, but Daphne no longer cared. The work mattered to her, and Benjamin valued her contributions too much to ask her to stop. One afternoon at the clinic, an elderly woman named Mrs. Davies clasped Daphne's hand after receiving treatment. You're a blessing, miss. Not many fine ladies would sit with the likes of us, hold our hands, treat us like we matter. You do matter, Daphne said firmly. Every person who walks through these doors matters. That's why we're here. Benjamin, overhearing from across the room, caught her eye and smiled, that warm, genuine smile that still made her heart flutter. This was the life she wanted, she realized. Not endless tea parties and social climbing, but meaningful work alongside a partner who respected and valued her. The night before her departure from London back to Bath for the wedding, the Duke hosted a small dinner party. It was intimate, just family and close friends, including Benjamin, Lady Agatha, and a few of the Duke's oldest companions. After dinner, the Duke drew Daphne aside into his study. "I have something for you," he said, producing a wooden box. Inside was a stunning sapphire necklace. "This belonged to your mother. Your father gave it to me for safekeeping before he left for his final campaign. He wanted you to have it when you married." Daphne's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know he'd left anything else. He left you his courage, his integrity, and his kind heart," the Duke said gently. "I see him in you every day, Daphne, and I see your mother's strength and grace. They would be so proud of the woman you've become, not because you're marrying well, but because you've chosen a path of purpose and meaning." "Thank you," Daphne whispered, embracing him, "for everything, for protecting me, for giving me space to heal, for supporting my choices even when they weren't conventional." "You've never been conventional, my dear," the Duke said with a chuckle. "That's what makes you extraordinary." Now about that night, Percival disappeared. "I don't need to know," Daphne interrupted gently. "Whatever you did, whatever happened, I trust it was necessary, and I'm grateful. You saved my life in every way that matters." The Duke's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You've become the daughter I never had, Daphne. Your happiness means everything to me." The journey back to Bath felt different this time. Daphne watched the countryside roll past, but instead of feeling like she was fleeing, she felt like she was returning home. Bath had become her sanctuary, the place where she'd rediscovered herself and found her future. Lady Agatha's house was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Flowers were being arranged, the cook was preparing the wedding breakfast, and friends kept stopping by with gifts and good wishes. Eleanor from the salon brought a beautiful leather-bound journal. "For recording your adventures," she said with a knowing smile. "Something tells me you and Dr. Thorne will have many worth documenting." The evening before the wedding, the women of Lady Agatha's circle gathered for an intimate celebration. They shared stories, laughter, and wisdom about marriage, partnership, and maintaining one's identity within a union. "The secret," Mrs. Fletcher said, "is to remember that you're not becoming half of a whole. You're two whole people choosing to walk the same path. Never diminish yourself to make a man comfortable." "Benjamin would never ask that of me," Daphne said confidently. "He values my strength, not my compliance." "Then you've chosen well," Lady Agatha said, raising her glass. "To Daphne, may your marriage be a partnership of equals, an adventure of the mind and heart, and a source of joy for all your days." As Daphne prepared for bed that night, she stood at her window, looking out over Bath's elegant crescents and squares. Tomorrow she would marry Benjamin Thorne, and together they would build a life of purpose and meaning. She thought of the frightened girl who had arrived here months ago, broken and ashamed, and marveled at how far she had come. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become. And tomorrow she would choose love, partnership, and a future bright with possibility. 6 months had passed since Daphne Ashford became Mrs. Benjamin Thorne, in a ceremony that had been everything she'd hoped for: intimate, meaningful, and filled with genuine love. The wedding in Bath Abbey had been attended by those who truly mattered: the Duke, Lady Agatha, the members of their intellectual circle, and patients from Benjamin's clinic who had insisted on witnessing the union of the two people who had shown them such kindness. Now, as autumn painted the English countryside in shades of amber and gold, Daphne stood in the morning room of their new home in Bath's Lansdowne Crescent, reviewing the accounts for the expanded clinic. Benjamin had secured funding to open a second location in a poorer district, and Daphne had taken on the role of administrator, managing finances, coordinating staff, and ensuring that no patient was ever turned away for inability to pay. "Mrs. Thorne, the supply order from London has arrived," called Mrs. Henderson, their housekeeper, a practical woman in her 50s who ran their household with efficient warmth. Daphne smiled at the name. She still felt a small thrill every time someone called her Mrs. Thorne, Not because she'd lost her identity in marriage, but because she'd chosen this partnership freely, with full knowledge of what it meant. She was still Daphne, still herself, but now she was also part of something larger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. Their home reflected their values, comfortable, but not ostentatious, filled with books and medical journals rather than purely decorative objects. The drawing room served double duty as a meeting space for various reform committees. The dining room regularly hosted dinners for colleagues, reformers and friends from all social classes, something that would have scandalized London society, but was perfectly normal in their progressive Bath circle. Benjamin emerged from his study, medical bag in hand, looking slightly harried but happy. "I'm off to the Avon Street clinic. We're expecting a difficult delivery this afternoon. Mrs. Patterson's fourth child. Will you be able to join me later? She's been asking for you." "Of course," Daphne said, rising to kiss his cheek. "I'll finish these accounts and be there by 2 o'clock. And Benjamin, don't forget we're hosting the Education Reform Committee tonight." He groaned good-naturedly. "How could I forget? Lady Agatha has been reminding me daily. She's determined to establish that women's college, and heaven help anyone who stands in her way." After Benjamin left, Daphne settled back to her work, but her mind wandered to the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the girl she'd been a year ago, trapped, frightened, believing her worth was determined by her ability to please a cruel man and conform to society's expectations. That girl seemed like a stranger now. The transformation hadn't been easy or instantaneous. There had been nightmares in the early months, moments of panic when Benjamin raised his voice in excitement and she'd flinched instinctively. But Benjamin had been patient, understanding, never making her feel weak for her fears. Slowly, she'd learned to trust again, not blindly but wisely, choosing to believe in someone who had proven himself worthy of that trust. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Henderson showed in Eleanor, her friend from Lady Agatha's salon, looking excited and slightly dishevelled. "Daphne, you'll never believe it. The City Council has agreed to fund the settlement house expansion. We'll be able to offer evening classes for working women, childcare for mothers who need to work, and a proper medical clinic. Your husband's presentation on public health made all the difference." Daphne embraced her friend warmly. "That's wonderful news. When do you begin?" "Next month. And I was hoping, well, we need someone to coordinate the educational programs, someone with organizational skills, connections to potential teachers, and genuine understanding of what these women need. Someone like you." Daphne felt excitement flutter in her chest. "I'd be honored. Let me discuss it with Benjamin, but I'm certain he'll support it. This is exactly the kind of work I want to do." After Eleanor left, Daphne reflected on how her life had become a tapestry of meaningful work. The clinic administration, the reform committees, and now potentially the settlement house education program. She was using her mind, her skills, her privilege to make tangible differences in people's lives. This was the purpose she'd always sensed was possible, but had never been allowed to pursue. That afternoon at the Avon Street clinic, Daphne held Mrs. Patterson's hand through the difficult labor, offering comfort and encouragement while Benjamin worked with focused intensity. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl with powerful lungs, Mrs. Patterson wept with relief and gratitude. "You're an angel, Mrs. Thorne," she said, clutching Daphne's hand. "Both of you. I don't know what we'd do without this clinic." "You'd manage," Daphne said gently. "You're stronger than you know. We're just honored to help." Walking home through Bath streets as evening fell, Benjamin took Daphne's hand. "You were remarkable today. Mrs. Patterson's fear was making the labor more difficult, but your presence calmed her. You have a gift for this work, Daphne." "I love it," she admitted. "Is that strange? To love sitting with laboring women and managing clinic accounts and arguing with city officials about public health funding?" "It's not strange at all," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "It's who you are, someone who finds purpose in service and meaning in making the world better. It's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." That evening's Education Reform Committee meeting was lively and productive. Lady Agatha presented her detailed proposal for a women's college in Bath, complete with curriculum plans, funding strategies, and a list of potential instructors. The debate was spirited, with Daphne contributing ideas about making education accessible to women from all social classes, not just the wealthy. Education shouldn't be a privilege of birth, she argued passionately. If we truly believe women deserve intellectual development, we must create pathways for working-class women too, evening courses, scholarship programs, childcare support. Spoken like a true reformer, Lady Agatha said with approval. You've come a long way from the timid girl who arrived on my doorstep, my dear. After the guests departed, Daphne and Benjamin sat together in their drawing room, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. The fire crackled softly, and outside, Bath's elegant streets were quiet under a canopy of stars. Are you happy? Benjamin asked softly. Daphne considered the question seriously. More than I ever imagined possible. A year ago, I thought my life was over, that I'd failed at the only thing women were supposed to do successfully. Now I realize that wasn't failure at all. It was escape. Percival's cruelty freed me from a life that would have slowly suffocated everything I am. I received a letter today, Benjamin said carefully, from London. Apparently Percival has entered a sanitarium in Switzerland. His family is calling it a rest cure, but the implication is that he's seeking treatment for his violent tendencies. Daphne absorbed this information quietly. I hope he finds healing, she said finally. Not for my sake, but for his own, and for anyone else who might have suffered from his inability to control his cruelty. People can change if they truly want to. You're remarkably compassionate, considering what he put you through. I'm not compassionate for his benefit, Daphne clarified. I'm compassionate for mine. Holding on to hatred would poison my happiness, and I refuse to give him that power over me. He's part of my past, but he doesn't define my present or my future. Benjamin kissed her forehead. You're extraordinary, Daphne Thorne. We're extraordinary together, she corrected. That's the difference. With Percival, I was expected to diminish myself to accommodate his ego. With you, we both grow larger, stronger, more capable. That's what partnership should be. A few weeks later, Daphne received an unexpected letter from Charlotte Blackwood. She almost discarded it, unread, but curiosity won out. The letter was surprisingly brief and, in its own way, honest. Miss Ashford, Mrs. Thorne, I should say. I write not to apologize, for we both know I'm not sorry for defending my brother. But I will acknowledge that I was wrong about you. You were never the weak, unsuitable woman I believed you to be. My brother's breakdown has forced our family to confront truths we'd long ignored about his character and our own complicity in enabling his worst behaviors. You escaped something that would have destroyed you. I hope you found the happiness you deserve. C.B. Daphne showed the letter to Benjamin, who read it with raised eyebrows. That's as close to an apology as Charlotte Blackwood is capable of, I suspect. It's enough, Daphne said. I don't need her approval or her remorse. But I'm glad she's facing reality. Perhaps the Blackwood family will emerge from this tragedy with more honesty and less arrogance. As winter approached, Daphne and Benjamin's life settled into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and joyful. Their days were filled with meaningful work, clinic hours, committee meetings, educational programs, and research. Their evenings were spent in conversation, reading, entertaining friends, and simply enjoying each other's company. The Duke visited frequently, clearly delighted with how his ward had flourished. Your father would burst with pride if he could see you now, he told Daphne during one visit. Not because you married well, though Benjamin is a fine man, but because you've become exactly who you were meant to be. You're making a real difference in the world, my dear. One crisp December morning, as Daphne reviewed applications for the Settlement House education program, she came across a name that made her pause. Miss Sarah Winters, her former lady's maid, who had been with her through the darkest days with Percival. Sarah had written a heartfelt letter expressing her desire to learn to read and write properly, to better herself and perhaps one day work in a school or hospital. Daphne immediately wrote back, offering Sarah not just a place in the program, but also assistance with living expenses and a promise of employment once she completed her studies. When they met again weeks later, Sarah wept with gratitude. "You've given me hope, Mom," Sarah said. "Just like you found your own way forward, you're helping others find theirs." That evening, Daphne stood at her bedroom window, watching snow begin to fall over Bath's beautiful crescents. Benjamin came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how strange life is," she said softly. "A year ago, I was trapped in a nightmare, believing I had no choices and no future. Now, I have more freedom, purpose, and happiness than I ever dreamed possible. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the same person who stood in that drawing room with bruises on her wrists, terrified and ashamed." "You're not the same person," Benjamin said. "You're who that person became when given the chance to grow, to heal, to choose her own path. You're the woman you always had the potential to be, once you were free to become her." Daphne turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. "I used to think freedom meant escaping constraints," he said. "Now I understand it means choosing your own constraints, choosing the work that matters, the relationships that nurture, the life that reflects your values. I'm constrained by my commitments to the clinic, the settlement house, our community. But I chose these constraints, and that makes all the difference. To choosing wisely," Benjamin said, kissing her gently, "and to blooming exactly where we've planted ourselves." As snow continued to fall outside, Daphne reflected on the truth she'd learned through pain and transformation, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that could happen. Percival's cruelty had freed her from a life of suffocating conformity. His disappearance had given her space to discover who she truly was, and his absence had made room for Benjamin, for real love, genuine partnership, and a life of meaning and purpose. She was no longer the Duke's ward, no longer defined by her broken engagement or her traumatic past. She was Daphne Thorne, physician's wife, clinic administrator, education reformer, and a woman who had learned that true freedom comes not from having no constraints, but from choosing which constraints to embrace in service of a life worth living. And she had never been happier. As Daphne and Benjamin's story reminds us, sometimes the darkest moments in our lives become the catalyst for our greatest transformations. True strength isn't found in never falling, but in rising with grace and choosing to build something beautiful from the ruins of what we thought our lives should be. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of courage, resilience, and the transformative power of choosing your own path. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which part of this journey resonated most with you, and share where in the world you're listening from. Your stories and perspectives make this community truly special. Remember, no matter what constraints you face, you always have the power to choose how you respond, who you become, and what kind of life you build. Like Daphne, you can bloom exactly where you choose to plant yourself. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you have the courage to choose freedom, the wisdom to recognize true partnership, and the strength to build a life that reflects your deepest values.